Silk does not belong on a mercantile counter beside horseshoes and salt pork, and Haunjong knew it even as she unwrapped the bolt with hands that would not quite stop trembling. The cloth had crossed an ocean folded in paper her mother sewed shut with her own needle. Now strangers leaned close to price it like feed grain. Otis Pell turned it over once, twice, and named a sum so small it felt like an insult wearing the shape of a number. Behind her, someone was already laughing. What Hyun did not yet know was that the silk would not leave that counter unclaimed, and that the man who claimed it would plant more in her name than she ever imagined asking for. Nathaniel Whitmore arrived at the worst possible moment, the way trouble in Cedar Hollow always seemed to know its cue, and he did not lower his voice for anyone's comfort but his own. His brother's widow, selling off heathen trinkets in the open street, he called it, loud enough to carry past the flour barrels and out the propped door. He was not there by accident. He held the paper that could take her land, and he wanted the whole town watching when he finally used it. Haeyeon folded what remained of her dignity the same careful way she had once folded that silk, and did not let him see her hands shake again. Two counties over, a man named Thane Calloway had a reputation for silence so complete that men measured their courage by how long they could stand in it without speaking first. He had buried more trouble than most sheriffs, and he trusted almost no one enough to explain why he did anything at all. He had never once set foot in Cedar Hollow's little mercantile before that morning. He would not explain, not then and not for a long while after, why he rode 2 hours out of his way to be standing at that counter exactly when the silk changed hands, or why the sum he paid for it bore no resemblance to Otis Pell's insulting offer. What neither Haeyeon nor the town understood yet was that the silk was only the first debt Thane Calloway meant to quietly settle that season, and not the largest. Somewhere in a bank ledger 2 streets away sat a note bearing her dead husband's name, a note Nathaniel Whitmore had been circling for months like a man waiting for weather to turn. Thane already knew what that ledger said. He had made certain of it. What he had not yet decided, riding home with a bolt of foreign silk wrapped in his saddlebag and a debt he had no earthly reason to want, was how much of himself he was willing to plant in ground the whole county had already called lost. Dust had settled over the fields behind Haeyeon-jang's cabin in a way that felt less like weather and more like a verdict. And she had stopped pretending, somewhere around the second week of the dry spell, that the sky intended to change its mind. 14 months had passed since Thomas Whitmore fell from the barn roof he was mending after a spring storm. 14 months since she had stood at a grave, in ground still too cold to properly dig, and in every one of those months since, the land he'd left her had given back exactly enough to keep her alive, and never quite enough to keep her safe. She had planted what seed she'd saved from last year's meager harvest, watched half of it fail to break the surface at all, and understood, with the plain, unsentimental clarity her mother had once used to diagnose a dying garden, that survival this coming winter would require seed she did not have money to buy. There was only one thing left in the cabin worth enough to change that arithmetic. It lay at the bottom of her trunk, wrapped in paper her mother had sewn shut, before Haeyeon ever boarded the ship that carried her from Busan to a husband she had met only through careful formal letters. A full bolt of silk embroidered with peonies in threads her mother had dyed herself, meant for the wedding hanbok. Haeyeon never had occasion to wear because Thomas, gentle and unpretentious, had married her instead in a plain dress before a circuit preacher who arrived a full season late. She had carried that silk across an ocean, the way other women carried photographs, unwrapping it perhaps 4 times in 3 years, always alone, always returning it to its paper before the ache of looking at it too long could take root. Her mother had died the winter after Haeyeon sailed, the letter arriving 8 months late with news already impossible to answer. And the silk had become, without Haeyeon ever choosing it to be so, the only object left on earth that her mother's hands had touched with the specific intention of blessing her daughter's future. Selling it felt less like commerce and more like severing something that had already, cruelly, been severed once. She wrapped it anyway, walked the 2 dusty miles into Cedar Hollow with the bundle held against her chest like something that might still bruise, and told herself, as she pushed open the door of Pell's Mercantile, that a woman who could not feed herself through winter had no business keeping heirlooms for company. Otis Pell took one look at the fine weave and named a price so low it barely covered a single sack of seed corn, and Hayan understood, standing there with her mother's last gift laid open on a counter built for horseshoes and salt pork, that the insult was not accidental. It was the going rate for a foreign widow's desperation, and everyone in that store, she realized as the whispers began behind her, already knew the number before she did. The whispers thickened the moment Otis Pell set his price, and Hayan recognized, without needing to turn around, the particular cadence of Beulah Sperry's voice pitched to carry exactly as far as it needed to, and not an inch further. Beulah had appointed herself, sometime in the 18 months since Hayan arrived in Cedar Hollow, as a picture bride nobody had asked for an opinion about, the unofficial custodian of the town's judgment, and she stood now near the flour barrels with 2 women from her sewing circle, watching the exchange with the frank satisfaction of someone finally handed proof of what she'd suspected all along. A woman who married into decent land and still ended up selling foreign fabric for grocery money, Beulah observed to her companions in a voice that pretended not to be for Hayan's benefit, was a woman who had never truly belonged to that land in the first place. Hayan kept her eyes on the counter, on the silk, on Otis Pell's blunt fingers pressing the fine cloth flat, as though testing whether it might yet yield a lower number. She had learned, in a year and a half of small daily cruelties, that a face which showed nothing gave her enemies nothing to repeat. She was still holding that composure, still counting the pitiful coins Pell finally slid across the counter, when the bell over the door rang hard enough to rattle its frame, and Nathaniel Whitmore filled the doorway with the particular self-satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for precisely this scene to walk into. He did not greet her. He looked instead at the silk still spread across the counter, at the coins in her palm, and smiled the way a man smiles when a difficult argument has just made itself for him without any effort on his part. His brother's widow, he announced to the room at large, reduced to peddling relics from some godless province just to scrape together seed money, and wasn't that. He asked no one and everyone exactly the proof the bank had been waiting for, that the Whitmore homestead belonged in hands that understood what real husbandry looked like. Hayan felt the coins bite into her palm as her fist closed around them, and understood, with a cold clarity sharper than any insult Beulah Sperry had ever managed, that this had never been about the silk at all. It had been about finding at last a public enough stage to say what Nathaniel had wanted to say since the day his brother died and left the land to the wrong widow. Thomas Whitmore had been, by every account Hayan ever heard repeated in Cedar Hollow after his death, a quiet and unremarkable man, the kind of steady presence people forgot to praise until he was no longer there to undervalue. He had written to her for the better part of a year before she ever crossed an ocean to marry him, careful formal letters that asked more questions about her than any suitor back home ever had. And when she finally stood before him at the rail depot in a traveling dress gone stiff with salt air, he had not remarked on her face or her figure the way she had braced herself to endure, but had simply asked whether the journey had been hard on her, and listened entirely to her answer. She had come to love him the way one comes to love a steady, unremarkable field, not with fire, but with roots that went down slow and held. Their marriage had been 3 years of plain, sufficient kindness, 3 years of learning a language and a landscape together, while he taught her to read brand marks and she taught him words for gratitude. His own language had never quite needed, and when he fell from the barn roof one wet spring morning, reaching for a shingle that would not seat properly, the grief that followed had been the uncomplicated kind. Sorrow without confusion, loss without the added cruelty of regret. What had followed his death, however, was considerably less simple. Thomas had borrowed against the land the previous autumn to buy breeding stock that never arrived before winter closed the passes, a debt Heon inherited along with the deed. And Nathaniel Whitmore, who had wanted that same parcel of bottomland since before his brother ever filed a claim on it, had spent every month since the funeral finding new ways to remind the county that a foreign widow with an unpaid note was not, in any court, a sympathetic judge might convene. An obviously secure custodian of 160 acres sitting directly atop the only reliable spring water for 3 miles in any direction. Heon had not understood, in those early confused months of grief, why Nathaniel's interest in her water rights ran quite so deep for a man who already held perfectly adequate grazing land of his own. She would not understand the true shape of it for some time yet, only that his visits, always framed as brotherly concern, always circled the well and the spring-fed creek with a persistence that had nothing to do with concern at all. The true shape of Nathaniel's interest arrived in Cedar Hollow 3 weeks before Heon ever unwrapped the silk, in the form of 2 men in unfamiliar city coats who spent 4 days riding the county with survey chains and a leather ledger, asking careful questions at the bank about which parcels held year-round water. Nathaniel met with them twice at the hotel, always after dark, always leaving through the back stair, the way a man leaves a place he does not want remembered walking into. Cedar Hollow's only banker, a nervous, precise man named Ansel Fairweather, who kept his ledgers as though they might one day be called to testify against him, had mentioned the surveyors to almost no one, but he had mentioned carefully and only once. Over a private supper Nathaniel arranged and paid for himself, that the Whitmore homestead note was 6 months from maturity, and that its holder, whoever that turned out to be, would have considerable say in whatever came next for that particular stretch of bottomland. A railroad spur, the surveyors had confided to Fairweather under considerable discretion, was being quietly routed through the territory to reach a proposed cattle shipping depot 2 counties east, and the single most valuable resource along that route was not grazing acreage at all, but water, reliable water, the kind that could be sold to a rail company at a price no homesteader's harvest could ever hope to match. Nathaniel had done the arithmetic before the surveyors ever left town. Buy the note, force the widow off through simple attrition or public shame, and control the spring that fed both the creek and, not incidentally, the very land the rail company would eventually need to lease or purchase outright. He had said none of this to Heon, of course, framing his visits instead as a brother's dutiful concern for a woman clearly overwhelmed by land she'd never been suited to hold. But Ansel Fairweather, watching Nathaniel count out coins for a supper he did not care about eating, understood exactly what kind of transaction was truly underway, and understood too, with the particular unease of a man who preferred his ledgers simple, that he had just become a quiet witness to something considerably larger than one widow's unpaid debt. Ansel Fairweather's bank occupied the narrowest building on Cedar Hollow's single commercial street, a fact that had always struck Haeun as fitting for an institution that seemed to make itself as small and unremarkable as possible whenever difficult questions arrived at its counter. She arrived there directly from the mercantile, with Otis Pell's insulting handful of coins still warm in her fist, determined to at least buy herself time on the note before Nathaniel's whispers could travel any further than the store. Fairweather greeted her with the particular nervous courtesy of a man rehearsing an unwelcome sentence, and it took him 3 false starts and a great deal of unnecessary ledger shuffling before he finally managed to say the thing he had clearly been dreading saying since she walked through the door. The Whitmore note, he explained, avoiding her eyes with the studied diligence of a man counting rivets, was no longer held by the bank. It had been purchased in full 6 days prior by a private buyer, and the bank's obligation in the matter, he added quickly, as though the distinction might soften what was coming, had therefore been entirely and properly discharged. Haeun asked, with a calm that cost her more than Fairweather could have guessed, who precisely now held her husband's debt and, by extension, the fate of everything she had left. Fairweather's answer, when it finally came, was not the name she had braced herself for. It was not Nathaniel Whitmore's. The note, Fairweather told her, now belonged to a rancher 2 valleys over named Thane Calloway, a man whose reputation in that part of the territory ran considerably ahead of any actual acquaintance most people had with him, feared for the trouble he'd settled in his younger years with a gun rather than a lawyer, and mistrusted precisely because no one could ever say with confidence what he actually wanted from any given transaction he entered into. Haeun had never once spoken to the man. She recalled him now only as a still, watchful figure at the edge of Pell's counter that very morning, a stranger who had said nothing and left before she could ask his business. The realization arrived slowly, and then all at once, the way cold water finds every gap in a coat. The entire fate of her home, her husband's grave, her mother's silk sold for a pittance not an hour before, now rested in the hands of a man whose silence she had mistaken, standing 3 feet from him for simple indifference. She did not wait for morning. Haeun rode the borrowed mule she kept for errands 2 full hours west along a road she had never traveled, arriving at the Calloway Ranch as the sky was turning, the deep bruised color that came just before true dark, and found the man himself, standing at a corral fence with a lantern already lit, as though he had somehow expected exactly this visit at exactly this hour. He did not seem surprised to see her, which struck Haeun as its own kind of answer before either of them had spoken a single word. She asked him plainly, without the pleasantries the territory usually demanded of a woman addressing a stranger's business, why he had bought her husband's debt, and what he intended to do with the power that purchase now gave him over her land, her home, and everything her husband had died, still owing. Thane Calloway considered the question for a length of silence that would have unsettled a less determined woman into filling it herself, and then answered only that he had his reasons, and that calling the note early was not among them. Haeun pressed him, unwilling to accept an answer built entirely around what he did not intend rather than what he did, and told him, with more heat than she had allowed herself to show anyone in Cedar Hollow in 14 months, that she had spent that same morning selling the last object her dead mother's hands had ever touched to strangers who mocked her for the price, and that she would not now stand quietly by while another stranger decided, from behind a locked ledger, whether the rest of what she owned belonged to him or to her. Something in Thane's expression shifted at the mention of the silk, some small crack in the careful stillness he otherwise maintained, though he offered no explanation for it, and Haeun, exhausted and furious and unwilling to give him the satisfaction of noticing her notice, did not ask. He told her only, before she turned the mule back toward the darkening road, that the note would keep until harvest, that he had no interest in taking land he had not worked, and that she should plant everything she could afford to plant, because the county, in his considerable experience, tended to underestimate exactly the wrong people at exactly the wrong moment. It was not comfort, precisely. it was not nothing either. No, Thane Calloway arrived at Haon's homestead 9 days later, without warning, and without, as far as she could tell, any particular urgency. Dismounting at her fence line in the unhurried manner of a man inspecting property, he already half suspected he would end up caring more about than he wished to admit. Haon watched him walk the perimeter of her dry fields from her cabin window for the better part of 20 minutes before she finally stepped out to meet him, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of appearing to have waited, though in truth, she had done little else since her muleback visit to his ranch. He asked to see her seed stores, her water source, the state of the small kitchen garden she had managed to keep alive through sheer stubborn attention, and Haon answered each question with the guarded precision of a woman being assessed rather than visited, uncertain whether she was being evaluated as a debtor worth extending patience to or as a parcel of land worth eventually absorbing. It was only when he finally sat across from her at the small table inside her cabin, having accepted, to her genuine surprise, the offer of tea rather than declining it the way most of Cedar Hollow declined anything she offered, that he laid out terms she had not expected. He would advance her credit against the coming harvest for whatever seed her silk money had failed to cover, not as charity, he specified, watching her closely as he said it, but as a business arrangement no different from any note a bank might extend a rancher it believed capable of repaying. Haon studied him across the small table, searching his carefully neutral face for the angle she was certain must be hiding somewhere beneath it, because in her experience, and in every hard lesson Cedar Hollow had taught her since she arrived, kindness offered without visible cost was simply cruelty that had not yet announced its price. She told him she did not need a man's charity dressed up as commerce, and he answered without heat that he had not offered charity, and that she was welcome to walk to Fairweather's bank and find a better rate anywhere else in the territory if she believed one existed. She did not have an answer for that. She poured him more tea instead, and understood, watching his hands wrapped carefully around the cup, as though he were unaccustomed to the gesture of being served in a home that was not his own, that whatever Thane Calloway wanted from this arrangement, it was not, at least, the thing every other man in the county seemed to want from her. News that Thane Calloway had been seen dismounting at the Whitmore widow's fence line traveled through Cedar Hollow with a particular speed reserved for information nobody had actually witnessed firsthand, and by the following Sunday's church service, Beulah Sperry's circle had assembled no fewer than 4 distinct and mutually contradictory explanations for the visit, ranging from a straightforward land grab to something considerably less charitable involving the word arrangement, said with the specific curl of a lip Haon had learned in a year and a half among these people to recognize instantly. She endured the service with her spine set the way her grandmother had taught her, and left before the customary lingering on the church steps could give anyone the satisfaction of watching her face for confirmation of whatever they had already decided to believe. Nathaniel Whitmore, however, was not content to let the gossip do its own slow work. He cornered Ansel Fairweather at the bank 2 days later, demanding to know under what possible reasoning the man had allowed a stranger to purchase a note that should, by Nathaniel's own repeated telling, have reverted naturally to family. And when Fairweather explained, with the particular helplessness of a man who had followed every letter of the law and was still somehow being treated as its author, that the sale had been entirely proper and entirely beyond his power to reverse, Nathaniel left the bank with a fury that Fairweather, watching him go, privately judged to be considerably larger than the situation strictly warranted for a man who claimed no personal stake beyond family duty. That fury found its target within the week, when Nathaniel began quietly circulating word among the county's Harvest Social Committee that a certain topic deserved airing at the upcoming gathering, a topic concerning propriety, land, and the wisdom of allowing a single dangerous man to hold quite so much unchecked power over a vulnerable widow's future, framing under a veneer of concern the very confrontation he had been waiting 14 months to stage. He had lost the note. He did not intend to lose the argument along with it, and he began, methodically, to build himself an audience. The Cedar Hollow Harvest Social had always been, in Hyen's admittedly limited experience of it, more a performance of the county's better nature than an actual expression of it. A single evening each September, when the church hall filled with borrowed tablecloths and competitive pies, and everyone pretended, for the length of a potluck supper, to be considerably more neighborly than the preceding 51 weeks had demonstrated. She had not intended to attend at all that year, still raw from the silk and the whispers and the note she now understood to be Thane Calloway's rather than Nathaniel's, but Reverend Combs had called on her personally to insist that her absence would only feed exactly the kind of talk she was trying to avoid, and so she arrived alone, in her plainest dress, and positioned herself near the door where a quick exit remained possible. She saw Nathaniel Whitmore working the room within the first 10 minutes, moving table to table with the particular energy of a man building momentum towards something, and understood, with a sinking certainty that settled somewhere beneath her ribs, that Reverend Combs's insistence had likely served someone's purpose considerably better than her own. It was Beulah Sperry, predictably, who created the opening, remarking loudly enough for the hall to quiet around it that some among them wondered whether certain vulnerable parties were truly being looked after with proper Christian judgment these days. And Nathaniel, as though the cue had been rehearsed between them, rose to his feet and declared to the assembled and now thoroughly attentive hall that the matter of the Whitmore homestead had become a community concern rather than a private one, that a foreign widow known to have sold family heirlooms in the open street for grocery money was now, by all appearances, entirely beholden to a man whose reputation for violence and secrecy was well known throughout the territory, and that surely, for her own protection, if nothing else, the note ought to be called and the land returned to proper family stewardship before matters progressed any further in directions decent company oughtn't speculate about aloud. The hall went very quiet in the particular way. A room goes quiet when everyone present has already decided which side they intend to applaud. Heyoon felt every eye in the building find her at once, and did not look away from a single one of them, though her hands, hidden in the folds of her plain dress, had curled themselves into fists. The silence that followed Nathaniel's speech lasted only as long as it took the door behind Heyoon to open, and every head in the hall turned as Thane Calloway stepped through it, hat still in hand, having apparently arrived at precisely the moment his name was being used to argue for a vulnerable woman's ruin. He did not raise his voice, which somehow made the hall fall more completely silent than any shout could have managed, and he addressed Nathaniel directly, asking whether the man speaking so freely about proper stewardship of the Whitmore land had personally worked a single acre of it in the 14 months since his brother's death, or whether his considerable concern had perhaps arrived rather more recently, alongside a pair of surveyors from the railroad who had spent 4 days that spring asking careful questions about which parcels in the county held reliable water. The hall's attention shifted visibly, and Nathaniel's face, Heyoon noted with a satisfaction she did not try to hide, lost some of its earlier certainty. Thane went on, unhurried, stating plainly that he did hold the Whitmore note, that he had no intention of calling it before harvest or after, and that in his considerable experience of this territory, a woman who had buried a husband, worked 160 acres alone through drought, and still found the means to plant a second season without asking a single soul for charity, had demonstrated considerably more stewardship than most men in that hall could claim over land they'd inherited outright. He turned then and looked directly at Hae-yun for the first time since entering and said to the entire assembled hall that he trusted her judgment over her land considerably more than he trusted the judgment of anyone currently seated at that harvest committee's table, and that any man who wished to argue otherwise was welcome to take the matter up with him personally, outside, at whatever hour suited him best. No one notably took him up on the offer. Hae-yun stood very still in the sudden roaring quiet of a room, reorganizing its opinion of her in real time, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched shut since the moment Otis Pell first named his insulting price for her mother's silk. They walked out of the church hall together, not by any plan either of them had spoken aloud, but because leaving separately after what had just occurred would have required a performance of indifference neither of them had the energy left to manage. The night air outside was sharp with the first real edge of autumn, and Hae-yun found herself unexpectedly furious, not at Nathaniel, whose cruelty she had long since learned to armor against, but at Thane, for standing up in front of an entire hall and settling, on her behalf, a fight she had wanted very much to finish settling herself. She told him so directly, walking beside him toward the hitching post, where her mule and his horse stood tethered, informing him that she had not asked to be defended, that she had spent 14 months proving she needed no one's rescue, and that his declaration, however well intended, had made her once again the subject of the room's attention rather than the author of her own account within it. Thane listened to the entirety of her complaint without interruption, which she found nearly as unsettling as the speech itself had been. And when she finally finished, he said only that he had not stood up to rescue her, but to correct a lie being told in a room full of people who would otherwise have believed it uncontested, and that there was a considerable difference between the two, even if the county's gossip would likely never bother to learn it. Hae-yun considered this, walking the last few yards in silence, and found she had no immediate rebuttal ready, which irritated her nearly as much as the original interruption had. She asked him, finally mounting her mule, why a man with no evident stake in her survival had twice now inserted himself into a fight that was not his. And Thane, checking his own saddle with more attention than the task strictly required, answered only that some debts got settled with money, and some got settled by making sure a lie didn't get to stand unanswered in a room, and that he'd had considerable practice over the years, recognizing which was which. It was not, Hae-yun thought, riding home under a sky gone fully dark, an answer that explained anything. It was, she admitted to herself somewhat unwillingly, an answer that made her want to ask a great many more questions. Nathaniel Whitmore did not sleep well the night of the harvest social, and the fury that kept him awake had very little room left in it for shame. He had lost the room, decisively and publicly, in a way that would take considerable effort to walk back through ordinary gossip alone. And he understood, staring at his own dark ceiling, that Thane Calloway's mention of the surveyors, however casually delivered, meant that his true purpose was no longer entirely hidden from the county's more attentive observers. He rode out before dawn to meet with two men he had hired quietly the previous month, rough hands from beyond the county line, who owed him favors considerably less legitimate than harvest labor, and gave them new instructions that had nothing to do with legal notes or bank ledgers. If the Whitmore homestead could not be pried loose through paper and gossip, he told them, watching the sky lighten over land he still believed belonged to him by every right except the legal one, then perhaps its water source required a more direct sort of persuading, something that would look, to any investigating eye, like nothing more than the ordinary bad luck a woman farming alone might reasonably expect to suffer. He did not specify further than that, and the men did not ask him to, understanding well enough what an unwatched well or a spooked and scattered herd might accomplish where a public accusation had failed. Nathaniel rode home satisfied in the particular hollow way of a man who has traded one kind of defeat for the private planning of another, telling himself that whatever happened next to Heyeonjong's homestead would simply be the territory reasserting the natural order that a church hall full of sentimental fools had briefly, foolishly interrupted. He did not yet know that Thane Calloway had, for reasons of his own that predated even the note's purchase, already arranged for a man of his own to be watching that same well most nights, at hours Nathaniel's hired trouble had not thought to account for. Whoa. The first morning, Haeun found new furrows already turned in her east field. Before she had even finished her coffee, she assumed, with the wary suspicion 14 months of Cedar Hollow had trained into her, that someone had trespassed with intentions she would need to guard against. It was only when she walked the rows and found them turned with a care and evenness her own single pair of hands had never quite managed alone, that she understood the trespasser had come to help rather than harm. And it was only the following week, catching sight of Thane Calloway's horse tied at her fence line in the gray hour just before sunrise, that she understood exactly whose hands had done the turning. He did not knock at her door to announce himself, and he did not linger past the work once it was finished, arriving before light and departing before she could properly thank him or properly object. A pattern that continued through most of that planting season with a consistency that felt less like charity and more, Haeun slowly came to realize, like a man who simply preferred to be useful in silence rather than credited for it aloud. She began, without entirely deciding to, leaving a cup of coffee on the fence post for him each morning, and began, over the slow accumulation of many quiet dawns, to notice small things about him that his stillness in town had never permitted her to see. The careful way he checked a young plant's roots before deciding whether it needed more water. The low, unhurried voice he used with her mule that no one in Cedar Hollow's church hall would have recognized as belonging to the same man who had silenced an entire room. The brief, unguarded ease that crossed his face on the mornings she managed to make him laugh, which was rare and which she found herself, somewhat to her own alarm, beginning to work for on purpose. She told him, one such morning, about her mother, about the silk, about the specific ache of packing an ocean's worth of grief into a single wrapped bolt of embroidered peonies, and then watching a stranger price it like feed grain. And Thane listened the entire way through without offering the easy comfort most people reached for, without telling her it would be all right, or that time healed such wounds, and simply said, when she finished, that some things a person carried were never meant to be gotten over, only carried differently, more easily, once someone else agreed to help hold the weight of them. The trouble came, as Nathaniel's hired men had clearly intended it to, on a moonless night deep enough into autumn that the cold alone would have explained why Haeun's small herd of cattle bolted from their pen without any obvious cause, if the gate had not also been found, the following morning, cut clean through with a blade rather than broken by any animal's panic. She woke to the sound of hooves scattering across dry ground and the low, urgent shout of a man's voice she recognized immediately as Thane's, already outside, already moving toward the pen before she had finished pulling on her boots, and found him when she reached the yard herself with a lantern shaking in her grip, working alone in the darkness to turn the frightened animals back from the open gate before they could scatter across unfamiliar range in a night cold enough to kill a lost calf by morning. She joined him without hesitation, running the fence line to head off two heifers bolting toward the creek, and together they worked through nearly an hour of cold, breathless effort before the herd was finally settled and the gate lashed shut with rope in place of the ruined latch. It was only once the immediate danger had passed, both of them breathing hard in the freezing dark, that Thane examined the cut latch by lantern light and told her plainly, with none of his usual careful reserve, that this had not been an accident, that a blade did not cut itself, and that whoever had done this had known precisely which gate would scatter the most animals into the most danger with the least chance of being seen doing it. Heian felt the fear she had been holding at bay all night finally catch up to her all at once. Not fear of the cold or the lost cattle, but the colder understanding that someone, somewhere in a county she had spent 18 months trying to survive, in peacefully, wanted her gone badly enough to risk her livestock's lives to accomplish it. Thane did not offer comfortable reassurance this time either. He simply told her, quietly, that he would be staying the rest of that night at her fence line, whether she wanted him to or not. And something in the flat, unnegotiable certainty of it made Hyun, for the first time in 14 months, feel considerably less alone than the size of her empty cabin had always insisted she was. Thane kept his word about the fence line, returning to sit watch over Hyun's pen for 3 more cold nights running, and it was on the third of those nights, both of them sharing the small warmth of a lantern and a blanket brought out from the cabin against the deepening chill, that Hyun finally asked him the question she had been circling since the harvest social: why a man with a reputation for trusting almost no one had chosen, twice now, to stake his own standing in the county on a widow he barely knew. Thane was quiet long enough that Heian assumed, as she had assumed every previous time he retreated into silence, that no answer was coming at all, and so his voice, when it finally emerged, low and unhurried in the dark, caught her by surprise more than the words themselves did. His mother, he told her, had come west from Ireland as a girl, not much older than Hyun had been crossing from Busan, married a proud, hard man who valued the appearance of prosperity considerably more than the reality of it, and had sold her own wedding ring, quietly, without his father's knowledge, during a lean winter when Thane was perhaps 7 years old and the family had nothing left to eat. His father had discovered the sale months later, not through any confession, but through a careless remark from a neighbor, and rather than accept the sacrifice for what it plainly was, had treated it as a public humiliation. An accusation of his own failure as a provider laid bare before the whole settlement, and had spent the following 2 years punishing her for it in ways Thane, even now, found difficult to describe aloud. She had died before Thane turned 11, worn down by a poverty her own quiet sacrifice had barely delayed, and a marriage that had never once thanked her for delaying it. He had watched, as a boy too young to intervene and too old to forget, exactly what it looked like when a proud man's shame got dressed up as righteous concern and turned entirely against the one person in the household who had actually tried to save it. When Nathaniel Whitmore stood up in that church hall and called Heian's silk a disgrace rather than a sacrifice, Thane told her, watching the lantern flame rather than her face, he had not seen a stranger's widow being wrongly accused. He had seen his own mother's ring being priced at a mercantile counter all over again, and had understood, in that instant, that he was not capable of sitting quietly through it a second time in his life. It was Hayen's turn to sit in silence after that, absorbing the shape of a grief that explained, all at once, every guarded stillness she had ever watched cross his face in town. And it was several long minutes before she found the presence of mind to ask the question that had been quietly nagging at her since the day she first learned he had purchased her husband's note without ever explaining why. She asked him carefully whether his interest in her silk that first morning at Pell's Mercantile had truly been the coincidence it appeared to be, or whether he had somehow already known, before she ever unwrapped the bolt across that counter, exactly what he was walking in to bid on. Thane's silence this time was of a different character entirely, and Hayen watched something like resignation settle across his features before he finally admitted, quietly, that it had not been a coincidence at all. He had heard, through channels he did not fully explain, that Otis Pell intended to buy heirloom silk cheap off a desperate widow and sell it at a considerable markup to a dressmaker 2 counties over, who cut such fine fabric down into ragline quilt backing, and something in that particular cruelty, the idea of a mother's careful embroidery unpicked and repurposed as scrap, because no one in that store thought its meaning worth preserving, had put him on the road to Cedar Hollow before he had fully decided what he meant to do about it. He had not planned to outbid Pell so openly, he admitted, nor to let Hayen see his face doing it, but standing at that counter watching her hands tremble as she unwrapped the paper her own mother had sewn shut, he had found himself considerably less capable of quiet restraint than his reputation generally suggested. He told her then, reaching beneath the wagon seat behind them, that the silk had never left his possession since that morning, that he had kept it whole and safe in a cedar chest at his ranch rather than let it become anyone's raglining, and that he had been waiting, uncertain, and for reasons he was only now beginning to properly understand himself, for the right moment to give it back to her, rather than simply hand it over like a transaction concluded. Hayen stared at the small wrapped bundle he produced, feeling something in her chest crack open considerably wider than the cold night air alone could account for. Word of the cut gate latch and the scattered cattle reached Cedar Hollow within days, carried this time not by Beulah Sperry's circle, but by a young ranch hand named Tobias Reyes, an orphaned boy of 12. Thane had taken on the previous winter, and who owed Hayen, though almost no one in town remembered it, a debt of his own from a fever the previous spring that the county's regular doctor had judged past saving, and that Hoyan's careful application of ginseng root and her grandmother's remembered remedies had, against every prediction, not. Toby had been riding fence for Thane the same cold week the cattle scattered, and had seen, from a distance he was careful to keep concealed, 2 unfamiliar riders meeting Nathaniel Whitmore at a crossroads well before dawn on the very morning the latch was found cut. He said nothing to anyone at first, uncertain whether a boy's word would carry any weight against the landowners, until Thane, gently and without pressing, asked him directly what he'd seen, and Toby, remembering the woman who had sat up 3 nights running to bring his fever down when no one else in the county had thought it worth the trouble, told him everything. Thane took the boy's account not to the sheriff, whose sympathies in a dispute between a rancher and a widow remained untested and unreliable, but directly to Ansel Fairweather, laying out plainly what the boy had witnessed, alongside what Fairweather himself already privately knew about the railroad surveyors and their careful questions about water rights. Fairweather, who had spent months uneasily complicit in a scheme he had never fully approved of, but had lacked the courage to obstruct alone, found in Thane's blunt, unadorned account of the matter a permission he had apparently been waiting for, and agreed, with visible relief, to lay the full financial picture before the county's harvest committee himself, rather than let Nathaniel continue framing the dispute as a simple matter of a foreign widow's questionable judgment. The confrontation, when it finally came, took place not in a public hall but in Fairweather's narrow bank, before a small assembled group of the county's more respected landowners and Nathaniel Whitmore, faced with a boy's eyewitness account, a banker's reluctant ledger, and a rancher's flat, unshakable certainty, found for the first time in 14 months that he had run entirely out of room to reframe the story in his own favor. The county's respected landowners, once the full shape of the scheme was laid plainly before them, proved considerably less patient, with a plot to hand their shared water rights to a distant railroad company than they had ever been with the ordinary business of gossiping about a widow's foreign habits. And Nathaniel Whitmore left Ansel Fairweather's narrow bank that afternoon. With his reputation in a state of ruin, his 14 months of careful campaigning had never once put Hayun's in. Word traveled through Cedar Hollow that week, with a speed that startled even Beulah Sperry, who found herself, for perhaps the first time in her long tenure as the town's unofficial arbiter of judgment, considerably behind the current of opinion rather than steering it, and who arrived at Hayun's fence line one gray morning with a jar of preserves and an apology so carefully worded it managed to admit fault without ever quite naming what the fault had been. Hayun accepted both the jar and the apology with more grace than either strictly deserved, understanding that the true reckoning in a town like Cedar Hollow rarely arrived as a single dramatic confrontation, but instead as this slow, uncomfortable accumulation of small corrections offered sideways by people who would never fully say aloud what they had gotten wrong. What moved through the county considerably faster than any apology, however, was the story of the silk itself, no longer whispered as evidence of a widow's disgrace, but retold with the particular relish small towns reserve for stories that flattered their better instincts, as proof that a man everyone had feared for his silence had in fact been quietly protecting a dead woman's final gift to her daughter from the moment he first laid eyes on it. The buyer no one had named that morning at Pell's counter was named now in every kitchen and church pew in Cedar Hollow, and Hayun, walking into the mercantile for the first time in weeks to find Otis Pell himself offering her a fair price on seed, without her having to ask twice, understood that something in the town's accounting of her had shifted permanently, not because she had changed at all, but because the story they told themselves about her finally matched the woman who had been standing in front of them the entire time. Yoam, the harvest that came in the autumn on Hayunjong's 160 acres was, by any measure the county's older farmers cared to apply, considerably better than the land's reputation had ever suggested it capable of producing, and it took Hayun several days of quiet counting before she fully understood why the yield so far exceeded what her own carefully rationed seed money, even supplemented by Thane's advanced credit, ought reasonably to have produced. She found the answer only when Toby, prompted by a question she had not quite meant to ask aloud in his hearing, mentioned offhandedly that Thane had spent several nights that spring, well before the fence line vigils began, walking her furthest fields alone in the dark with a second sack of seed corn he had purchased with his own money and never once mentioned. Planting rows she had assumed, in the exhausted blur of that season, she must simply have managed herself without fully remembering the effort. She confronted him with this discovery at the harvest gathering the county held that year, considerably larger and warmer than the previous social had proven itself to be. And Thane, cornered at last into an explanation he had clearly hoped to avoid giving, admitted only that a debt owed to a dead woman's memory, his own mother's, felt considerably easier to settle by planting something that grew than by any other gesture he had ever managed to think of. The whole town had gathered that evening to see the results laid out on long tables under lantern light, squash and corn and wheat, from land they had once called cursed and barren both. And Hoyan stood at the center of it in a dress she had finally, after 18 months of packing it away, found the courage to make from the silk her mother had sewn shut, and Thane Calloway had refused to let strangers cut into rags, half Korean embroidery and half frontier calico, the two halves of a life she had stopped needing anyone's permission to call whole. When Thane asked her, in front of the assembled county, whether she would consider planting the rest of her seasons beside him rather than merely near him, Heian understood that he was not asking her to be rescued, the way Cedar Hollow had once assumed a widow in her position would need to be, but asking to be chosen back, in exactly the same public, unhidden way he had once chosen to stand up for her. She said yes, standing in that dress, in that light, in front of every person who had once priced her mother's silk like feed grain, and felt the word barren, wherever it had once tried to attach itself to her name, finally lose every trace of its power for good. Nathaniel Whitmore was not present to see any of it, having sold what remained of his own modest holdings within a month of the bank confrontation, and left the county entirely rather than remain to watch the story he'd tried so hard to author get rewritten decisively without him in it. And Cedar Hollow, Heian found, mourned his departure considerably less than it had once feared her own. The following spring, standing at the same fence line where Thane had once left a coffee cup untouched and a field turned in silence before dawn, Heian asked him whether he had any regrets left about a debt that had begun, technically as a stranger's business transaction, and ended somewhere neither of them had fully planned to arrive. And Thane, watching the new season's seed go into ground that had once been called cursed by an entire county too quick to judge a woman by the shape of her grief, told her he had exactly one regret: that he had not walked into Pell's Mercantile a full year sooner, before she had spent even a single morning believing her mother's last gift was worth no more than the lowest price a frightened man could offer for it. Heian told him there was no version of that year she would trade away entirely, not the silk, not the note, not even the cruelty, because every hard turn of it had led her, eventually, to exactly this field and exactly this man, and a town that had finally, imperfectly, learned to see her plainly rather than through the fog of what it had assumed a foreign widow ought to be. If a story like this one has ever reminded you that the things people shame you for selling are sometimes the very things that lead someone worth keeping straight to your door, tell us in the comments which moment of Heian's story struck you hardest, and if you want more stories of quiet women who outlasted every insult the world threw at them and found the home and the love they were always owed. Subscribe, because there are many more like her still waiting to be told.